Hey everybody, welcome along. My name's Alan Furley. This is the second of my LinkedIn Lives. So I'm doing a series of them, and today I want to help you understand how you can create a standout CV. So how you can make sure that you think through what's really going to showcase your talents and make sure that that CV, which doesn't define you, but is a massively important part of your job searching process, is one that maximizes your chances of getting to that next step rather than reduces them. So, and just some framing there, the CV is not going to get you a job. What I'm going to talk about today is how it can really help amplify your ability to succeed in the job hunting process. But in a way, the CV is there to get you an interview, and the interview is what hopefully will bring across your true self and allow you to get the job that you really want, and hopefully that you can demonstrate that you'll be really good at. So the CV itself, I learned last year, was the first one was allegedly written by Leonardo da Vinci some 500 years ago. So it's been with us for a while, and love it or hate it, it's a pretty fundamental part of many, many hiring processes that you'll go through. So today I'm going to talk about how you can do things with your CV or not do things with your CV to maximize your chances of securing a job. My background, for those of you who don't know, so I've worked in recruitment for 20 years. I've run my own business for over 10 years, a recruitment business. So the experience that I'll draw on today is from the recruiters I have within my business, the experience I've got personally working with hundreds of clients, seeing thousands of CVs over the years, but also the experience I've had hiring people for my business. So I've had to look at CVs to judge people. I've then met people at an interview. And so I can tell you personally kind of how I found that dynamic and what's really stood out to me, both as a hirer myself, but also as a recruiter working with all sorts of companies. I've worked with companies in the startup sector, which is where we focus now, with big corporates, with people in the public sector as well. And there's some things that are pretty consistent above all the sectors. Along the way, if you've got any comments, questions, any thoughts on what I'm talking about or things that I haven't covered, then please do jump into the chat and I'll look at those comments and come back to you. I'll also, although I've got some content to cover that I've thought about, I'll make sure I leave some time at the end to answer any questions that you've got. So the agenda really is to talk about some of the things you really want to avoid in your CV, what are the mistakes that might be holding you back and really reducing your chances of getting the right role, and what do you need to maximize your chances. So to begin with, the things that you want to avoid, well, and some of these might seem really obvious, but perhaps they're only obvious if you've sat my side of the fence or if you've gone through a few processes and learned that way. So the first one is make sure your CV isn't hard to read. So, and that can look like a number of things. So if it's 10 pages long, realistically, how likely is it that someone's going to spend the time looking through that? It might be that it's much shorter, maybe 1, 2, or 3 pages, but maybe it's really hard to read because there's so much on there. I look at CVs sometimes and all I see is a sea of text. So either from a design perspective or in terms of the amount of information on there, it's really hard to get to the essence of what the CV is trying to say to me. So hard to read could be because of the length of it, but it could be because of the formatting, the design, the way that you've laid it out. Clearly, starting with your oldest job at the top is not something you'll see very often, but is an extreme example of where you make it hard for people to get to the crux of what they want to know, which is more likely to be what you've done recently than what you did a long time ago. If it's written in really formal language, then it's probably going to be quite hard for someone to read. So you can look at all sorts of tools around readability and whether it's suitable for can an 8-year-old read it? That probably should be the benchmark for a CV, even if it's talking about things that are, have been many years in the making. So make sure it's not hard to read. Another key thing is that it doesn't stand out. And mainly when I say that, I'm thinking about something that is very generic and sounds harsh sometimes when I'm giving feedback to people individually, is really bland and boring. So the amount of times I've jumped onto a call or been referred to somebody who wants a bit of help with their CV, and I'm chatting to that person, in person, having a coffee or on a Zoom call, and I get so much energy and excitement from hearing them talk. And I can think that if I was hiring for a chief technology officer or for a head of sales, I'd really want to work with that person. And I look at their CV and it's a really bland and boring version of that person in front of me. So that might be that it's all about the roles and the responsibilities, very generic. So it's saying, I made sales, I brought on board customers, I did some marketing, whatever version of that might be. And it doesn't give a sense as to exactly what they achieved. There's no context to that. So have a look at your CV. And if it reads like a job description, it's probably not doing a very good job of showcasing you and your achievements. So you want to make sure it's not hard to read. You also want to make sure that it's not bland and boring and failing to stand out. And the third point is it really needs to avoid being something that is generic in terms of not defining the sorts of roles that you're looking for, or being very wide reaching. And if someone reads it and think, well, this person could do a number of different things, but I don't really see how they are relevant for what I'm looking at, then there's a real danger that they'll move on to the next one. And I've seen all sorts of research saying that some recruiters, some hiring managers might only spend 10 seconds looking at a CV. And maybe it's a bit more than that, but there's no doubt that something that just has no appeal and is very wide reaching is unlikely to have a hook that's going to capture their attention before they move on to the next one. So those are some things that you really want to avoid. And if there's any questions or thoughts on some of those things I've covered there, then please drop a comment into the chat and I'll come back to it. So if those are the things you want to avoid, so having something that's hard to read and bland and boring and very generic, then more positively, what is it that you need to make sure you have within your CV? So it won't surprise you that some of those things are the opposite of what I'm saying you want to avoid. So don't make it hard to read, make sure it's easy to read. I don't particularly buy into the belief that a CV has to be 2 pages. I can see there's much more value in having a CV that's 2 pages than one that's 22 pages. And believe me, I've definitely seen someone that have hit that number. But it needs to be concise. Typically, if it's 1 page, then it's going to be easy to read, but it's probably not going to get across the depth of experience and potential that you could bring to the role. So 2 to 3 pages is typically what you'll find. If it's 2 pages and a couple of lines, I would definitely work hard to bring it down to 2 pages and not have 80% of that third page wasted. But if it's around about 3 pages, then I wouldn't necessarily try and leave a third of it out to get it down to 2. So having something that's easy to read is partly around the length of it, but also having white space. So if you look at your CV and think there is no white space or can't see any white space, it probably means you've got too much on there. So if everything is important, then nothing is important. So really make sure that you're highlighting the key things rather than everything. Your CV, going back to one of the comments I made earlier, should be about getting you an interview. So it doesn't need to tell your whole life story. It doesn't need to be something that gives every single detail of what you can do and what you've done previously, but it does need to be something that gives some of the key things, but make sure that is the key things and not everything. Make sure it's in a readable font. Make sure that it's not too much trying to look like a heavily designed document that maybe makes it difficult to read. So there's definitely a benefit in having something that kind of conforms without being something that looks exactly like everybody else's. So make sure it's easy to read. One of the most important things as a second point is that it has to tell your story. So one of the things I said to avoid is something that is really bland and boring and is a list of responsibilities. So you do need to talk about what you've done, but you also need to talk about what you've achieved, and you need to give some context to it. So if I'm looking at a CV for a chief revenue officer, then I want to know some of the basics of the role, because not all chief revenue officers are equal and not all chief revenue officers are the same. But probably what I really want to know is a bit of context. So if you can get across over the 3 years you were there, what was the from A to B journey that you went on with them and that you led on the sales side? And as part of that, how can you give a sense of achievement that perhaps in a sales role is easier to think about in terms of numbers and percentage over target or amount of revenue delivered? But no matter what the role, how can you make sure that if someone's looking at 10 CVs, yours is making it really clear what you achieved versus putting you into a pool with everybody else and looking like just another CRO in this example. So how can you put in a sense of context and achievements there to, in the eyes of the reader of that CV, they'll understand as much as they can from 2 pages of A4 what you achieved for that company and start to think about what that means you can achieve for them. And that's my third point. So making it easy to read, point number 1, telling your story, point number 2. The third point builds on those and is about talking to the buyer. So in effect, your CV is trying to sell your chance of getting to that next stage. So getting to an interview, and it needs to then talk to the buyer. So if I'm a CEO of a seed stage business and the next milestone I'm aiming for is getting to whatever the metrics look like at Series A, then how can you talk to me about your ability to do that? And how can you give some context to your achievements previously, but also frame it against the job that the buyer wants to be done? So maybe I'm looking for someone to help me scale. I've got some product market fit, and this is about scaling into new markets. So how can you talk about that in your CV to give them a sense as to the potential you can fulfill for them, rather than, again, look like a job description of what you've done? So the achievements is the key thing here. If I think about the last 10 CVs I've looked at, going back to my point earlier, these are people that when I talk to them, I'm really excited about what they achieved. If I look at their CV, I see very little of what they achieved. So I know this person has achieved loads, and if I was hiring for a role that they fitted into, I'd have the confidence they could achieve loads for me. But there's a real danger if their CV doesn't show what they've achieved, then I may never get the chance to meet them, and I may move on to a CV that showcases better. And I think, particularly if you're British, maybe there's a philosophy around, well, don't show off and don't be boastful and arrogant. But I think your CV does really need to showcase you. So if you're not a little bit embarrassed about some of the things you're putting on your CV, you definitely shouldn't be lying around them. So don't be embarrassed because they're not honest. But if you're not a little bit embarrassed because you're presenting yourself in your best light, you should probably go back and emphasize a little bit more what you should be proud of and what you've achieved previously. And make sure what you're emphasizing is relevant. So your CV is a document that you're writing for you on one level, but of course it's got to be relevant for the role that you're looking at. So I'm often asked a question in terms of, should I tailor my CV? And I definitely think that if you're applying for particular roles, your CV wants to be tailored to a degree. So that doesn't mean rewriting a CV in its entirety, but it does mean that if you're applying for a role with a certain title, then you need to look at the job spec and you need to think about how well your CV demonstrates you've got the relevant skills and the relevant experience. So going back to what's essential, make sure it's easy to read, make sure it tells your story, and make sure it's relevant and talks to the buyer, the person that you want to be reading that CV and getting really excited about the job that you could do for them. A couple of other things to cover. Like I said, there's definitely a benefit in tailoring your CV, particularly if you've got the context around what the person who's the hiring manager or who's recruiting for this role is going to be looking for. The reality is that sometimes, typically bigger organizations might have some screening software to begin with. So you'd need to think about how you can use language that will appeal to an algorithm that might be judging if you can do a senior operations role. So maybe that's about expanding ops to operations in some cases, making sure you've got relevant titles on there. Maybe in the profile that you're writing at the top of your CV, it talks about ideally looking for a chief operating officer role. So there might be some really easy things you can do that avoid you being caught out by an automated process at the beginning. But hopefully you get through that pretty quickly and you're then, your CV's in front of a human, then make sure it's excited by the opportunity there and make sure you're really demonstrating your capabilities, but also what you need or what you're looking for in your next role. A question around covering letters is often put to me, and personally, I wouldn't necessarily see much value in covering letters if you think of them in the context of the traditional covering letter, 1 or 2 pages long, that I remember many years ago writing for some graduate jobs I was applying for. But if the essence of a covering letter is to demonstrate your relevance and your interest in the role, I would 100% make sure you're doing that. You could do that through tailoring your CV. You could do that through sending a note to the hiring manager on LinkedIn, or in the email with the CV, then putting 1 or 2 paragraphs in there. So definitely make sure you emphasize why you're relevant and why that's important, whether it's CV, covering note, email, but don't necessarily think you need to provide a covering note unless it's in particular something that's been asked of you. So we're kind of coming up to the 15-minute point. So I've covered most of the things I wanted to. I'm definitely happy to hang around and answer any questions or any comments that people may have. In terms of takeaways, I guess, from some of the things I've talked about. So hopefully you've remembered some of the things that you want to avoid, like having a CV that's hard to read and really kind of quite bland and boring and generic. The essential things, making sure it's easy to read, it tells your story, and be positive and be able to back that up. And I guess remember that your CV is slightly strange in that it's a historical document. So it's talking about all the things you have done, but its purpose is to give you the chance to do something new. And of course, there's got to be enough alignment with those 2 things to make sure that there's relevance. But you really want to view your CV as something that is framed against that future opportunity. What is it that you're looking for? Which doesn't mean you can make things up on your CV, but maybe there's some of the experience there you don't need to emphasize quite as much. Maybe there's some of the bits about what you did you can draw out more for this particular future opportunity than you would do if you're applying for a different type of future opportunity. And as part of that, no job is ever really the same, so give confidence that you're going to be able to adapt as you go. So I hope that's been useful. We've been talking about how you can create a standout CV to make sure you're maximizing your chances of success in the job process. I'm going to do another LinkedIn Live in 2 weeks' time, so on the 30th of August. And that is also helping those of you that are out there looking for work at the moment. But apart from the CV, another key part is obviously how you go about the work search. So that's what we'll be covering at the end of the month. It's strategies for effective job hunting. So that's partly around the CV. It's also around networking. It's about how you might engage with recruiters, how you might find opportunities that recruiters aren't likely to access for you, how you can figure out who are the companies that you really want to work for, even if they aren't necessarily advertising for roles right now. And hidden jobs that don't get advertised are a big part of how roles get filled for sure. So if you're interested in exploring more to help you with your career search, then have a look back through this video today, but also I'll put out details over the next week or 2 of the next event, but that's August the 30th at 4 p.m. UK time. If you've got any feedback, then please drop me a message on LinkedIn. It's normally good on what we covered today, and I would hope to see you again then. Thanks very much.